Shamanism 108. Understanding personal power, the soul, and soul loss. Many of us are looking for a strong sense of self, and that's one of the reasons why so many are coming back to or rediscovering, returning, or even maybe finding for the first time their way back to shamanism. Practicing shamanism involves a deep understanding of the concept of power and the right use of power. I want to start by talking a little bit about our bodies, because the body, left to its own devices, is in this continuous state of death and rebirth, shedding and growing. Our skin is shedding, new skin grows, our bones shed old fractures, the bone regenerates, our blood is taking away toxins so that the organs can eliminate them from the body, and then new blood circulates to feed our organs in turn. When there's a breakdown in this process, illness happens. We also have an ego and a psyche that are part of our integrity, of our inherent being. Our psyche is also constantly working through changes in our dream state. The ego, whose true function is to perceive time and space for us, has become very complex, and it doesn't always follow the flow of life. Life is change, and moving with and flowing with that change is the foundation of power. Power is the ability to transform any energy. When we are whole and healthy and in our power, the possibilities for what we can do are endless. But we need to understand as well the right use of power. What does it mean to be using our power the right way? To move with the forces of nature, to have power from within rather than power over and try to control from the outside. True power is transformative. With true power, we can transform negative energy of any illness, and also in the earth, in our water and in our air. Ultimately, with true power, we can transform suffering into joy. So we're going to move into the ineffable, and the concepts I'm going to talk about are going to be really hard to understand if you're coming from this rational, logical place, which we tend to do in our society. We support the left brain functions, the logical, the rational parts of ourselves. But as we learn more and more in the evolution of our consciousness, we realize that reality isn't logical as we've supposed it to be. There's much more to be seen than what we can see with our human eyes. This is coming back to the third eye and the ability to see beyond and inside. As we go on the spiritual journey and we expand our awareness, we wake up abilities that have gone dormant, and we experience and perceive more of life than we're able to if we're just living in logic. We have to use our right brain functions. We have to open our intuition. We have to use our imagination and our senses to perceive reality in a different way. We have to see, hear, feel, and smell from a different place inside of ourselves. And when we learn to do that, to expand our senses, our sense of self, we step into the world of the shaman. There's many levels in these worlds, but as we travel through the upper and the lower, we realize that we live in an unlimited universe. Sometimes these new belief systems can be hard to deal with, because when we use that more intuitive part of ourselves, society might not accept it. We might be seen as dangerous. So we've lost our imagination in order to fit in. But a question I ask is, how can we create a healthy planet, a healthy body, or abundance for ourselves if we can't imagine or envision what it is that we want? And do you remember when you were young, when you were a kid, and you had to stop talking to your imaginary friends, or you were told to stop daydreaming? The truth is, we were born understanding these hidden realities. We naturally knew the way of the shaman, but we were programmed to unlearn that path as we became socialized. And I'm so happy to see that so many of us are turning back to that childlike state of play and wonder. Now we need to talk about soul, because if we're going to talk about soul loss, we need to understand what it is that can get lost. And the word soul has taken on so many meanings. In some ways, we can understand it as our vital life force, the uh, life essence of us, the very soul essence of a person. It's also maybe understood as the wild part of us, the uncivilized part. We've civilized our bodies, we're shaving our legs and wearing shoes and walking around on streets, fitting ourselves into boxes and structures like the Roman calendar, for example, but the soul is more free. The really cool part about talking about the soul is that it's more of a unification, at least for me, understanding the soul as this unit of the body and the mind and the spirit, making up you. Your soul is a combination of your sensations, your thoughts, and your emotions. I've got an illustration here of braided sweetgrass with the idea that a 3-stranded cord is always stronger than 1 or 2 strands. And in order to be whole, the Trinity must be in balance. We want to be aligned through our entire being. So the way we feel, the way we think, and our experience in the world around us align with who we are on the inside. Another way of thinking about soul is to negate it, because we know we have a soul because we know what it's like when we lose it. We use it in language. We can call something a soul-sucking. This job is soul-sucking, for example. We can also talk about the gaining of soul, like soulful music or a piece of art that just has so much soul. Or we can even say about a person that they're really soulful. But let's talk about this idea that we can lose our soul. And when we lose our soul, we're losing something invaluable. Losing your soul means that you're losing yourself. You're losing your power, your purpose, and your shine. And it's actually quite easy to explain soul loss. Most of us have an intuitive sense of what it means. What's going to be harder for me to explain is the effects of soul retrieval. But let's stay focused on soul loss for the moment. The soul is invulnerable. It cannot be destroyed, but it can be shattered. It can be broken apart. The soul can get shattered by emotional, physical, and spiritual trauma. And a lot of these things happen very early for us in childhood. And nobody suffers more than the children who are still living inside of us. So soul retrieval is this ancient technique in shamanism that helps bring those children, those lost parts home. But let's go back to soul loss. In every person, there's a piece of the soul that weeps when we live down to a smaller version of ourselves. And when the pain is great enough, that piece leaves us. And the ancients call this many things. They called it soul loss, fragmentation, or spiritual wounding. What is it that actually causes this loss of our vital essence? In the ancient times, they thought of it as the soul being frightened away, or running off on adventures, or even being stolen. Today, we use the word trauma. The basic premise is that when we experience trauma, a vital part of our soul essence separates from us in order to survive the experience by escaping the full impact of the pain. It's also important to notice that what constitutes trauma is going to be different from person to person. And how many parts of our soul can we lose? Well, it depends on you. It depends on your story. There have to be at least as many parts left in ordinary reality as there are in non-ordinary reality, however, for a person to still be here. Because we cannot function if we're more out of our bodies than we are in ourselves. When a person experiences soul loss, it creates an opening in their vital life force, in their auric field. And this means that we have blind spots where other energies may come in and compete for control. We've talked about this in the Chronicles of Darkness, and I just want to bring that back here so that we understand very clearly one of the dangers, many dangers, of living with lost pieces of our souls. So let's talk about some signs of soul loss, and they're not always immediately apparent. Sometimes we notice right away, and sometimes it takes a long time for us to realize that actually a really important part of us is missing. We might feel depressed, and actually depression is one of the sort of symptoms, classical symptoms of soul loss according to most shamans. People who have suffered soul loss may be living in a sort of dream world or feel numb and disconnected from their emotions, from themselves. And a lot of us actually know that we've had soul loss. We can feel it, and we spend a lot of our energy looking to retrieve those parts of ourselves, but we don't know how. So we're doing this from an unconscious place, and we're doing this in many different ways, whether it's dreaming and daydreaming, getting lost in movies and books, experimenting with a whole bunch of hodgepodge spiritual paths, and creating relationships that help us re-experience those original traumas, trying to figure out a way to get back there. And a lot of us walk around not feeling quite whole. We feel like we're not really here. We feel like we're not living to our full potential. And the more we become aware of this, the more we want to recover the intensity of life, the playfulness, the intimacy, which we enjoyed when we were young. We want to come fully home to ourselves and come home to the people that we love. It's also true that some people feel that they don't remember anything at all from their childhood. This could be a really strong indication that soul loss has in fact occurred. Strong feelings of low self-esteem or feeling powerless is also an indication. So is destructive behavioral patterns, addictions. But what I really want you to take away as well is that soul loss affects each of us in a different way, because we are individuals, we are unique beings. So the best way to know about your situation or to investigate the situation with somebody else is to ask the helping spirits for guidance. And where do lost soul parts go? For psychologists, they go into an undifferentiated region that they call the unconscious. And for the same psychologist, the nature and the kind of geography and topography of the unconscious, where these lost pieces go, is not so important. But for a shaman, the question of where the lost pieces of soul go is essential to the healing process. From the shamanic view, the lost parts of the soul don't go into this undifferentiated no man's land. They go to a parallel existence in non-ordinary worlds. Some souls could be trapped in a fearful place, and others might even have found a more pleasant world where they prefer to stay. Before we start talking about bringing the soul pieces back, let's understand how soul loss happens. And even though in Western kind of culture, soul loss is not yet a recognized phenomena, our language actually shows that we experience it. We hear people say things like, when my husband left me, a part of me went with him, or when my brother died, I died with him, or what she did broke my heart, broke my spirit, killed my soul. These are all sort of indications. We realize within ourselves that soul loss has happened. When we lose a part of our soul, a hole is created in our etheric body. And even though that soul loss might not be massive and we can survive and lead a fairly good life, we live with these holes or rips or tears or weaknesses until something happens to us when we need that missing energy. And that's when we really notice that we're not fully ourselves. When we're in these challenging times in our life that demand us to be strong and whole and healthy to cope with the situation, we realize something is missing, and we react by becoming unwell. If you are familiar with the psychological concept of disassociation, you'll know what I'm talking about. And I do think soul loss is very similar to that. There's a disassociated part with ourselves that we cut off, that cuts off from us, that splinters and splits. And even though it might be a survival mechanism for us in the moment, it makes us more vulnerable later in life because we are not really fully with ourselves. And trauma happens throughout our lives, and it can be so many things. And again, what's traumatizing for one person might not be so for another person. But what's important to understand is there's a way to recover what's been lost. Soul's parts might leave a child who doesn't feel loved, or who feels abandoned or rejected by their parent. A soul might leave the body to survive a physical or sexual assault or abuse. In these cases, the traumatized person literally escapes out of the situation, out of the body, to survive. And that feeling of, I'm not really here. Or people talk about as well, when something really traumatic happens, that they kind of, when the memory is seeing themselves as though they were looking from the outside, which is another sign that the soul was not inside the body of that time. And so many cultures across the world from the beginning of time believe that you can and do lose pieces of your soul through extreme and persistent trauma. Your spirit leaves the body and you feel like you're on autopilot, feeling a bit lost, detached, hollow, and often hopeless. If the soul loss is unconscious, the spirit will perceive our need for protection without thought or choice on our part, and the soul will leave on its own accord in the interest of self-preservation. These pieces can get left behind in that place and time, waiting for us to come and find them. Another thing that's really important to talk about is these kind of really capital T traumas of incest and abuse, where such an unfortunate and such a extremely high percentage of men and women in the world are survivors of incest and sexual abuse. And this will invariably cause soul loss. The child will feel both invaded and powerless. It's that loss of innocence, very much. And life doesn't have that safety or grace that came from that innocent part of our soul. The world becomes a very unsafe place to be. We lose our protection, we lose our glow. And so for survivors, there's a range of complicated emotions relating to their past, including guilt, shame, invalidation, love, hate, humiliation, among others. Again, when somebody is violating your space, and you have soul loss, it's very possible and so painful and so unfortunate that they might put their own or put that dark, hateful energy into your space that was created when your soul left. Another thing that happens with soul loss is that people steal our soul in order to gain power. The person might be envious of us and might be attempting to take our power to use it for themselves, to put themselves in power over us or power over others. Envy and jealousy is kind of along the lines of that. It's also possible that somebody is full of wutiku and very greedy, and they want to have power not only over us but over many, many people, and using these kind of gigantic communication tools that they have to their disposal to generate a kind of cultural trauma and generate soul loss on a very large scale. It's also very possible that a person gives their power away. But let's talk a little bit about soul loss in soul thievery. So I'm going to use the word thief, but without judgment or blame, because most people who steal souls are more ignorant than intentionally harmful. And soul theft is a really hard concept for many of us to understand. Why would somebody steal souls, and how can we explain this, and how can we be compassionate towards people stealing souls? Well, often soul thieves believe that their survival is dependent on using the life force of another. And often they don't want to give the soul back if we go there and try to return it or retrieve it. But in shamanic practice, a shaman must act in accordance with the harmony of the universe, which means that we cannot do harm to a person who has stolen another person's soul. So there's a few different ways to work around it. It's to explain, for example, to the thief how their actions and behavior are causing harm to somebody else. We can also do a trade and ask them to return the soul in exchange for a gift. Sometimes we might help them find their own power animal, for example, or a guardian spirit who can provide a source of energy and strength to the thief, so that they don't need to do it by stealing from another person. It's also important to understand that soul thieves invariably always also themselves suffer soul loss. So another way to help a soul thief heal is to do a soul retrieval for the thief. Once they have their own power and vitality back, they don't need to use somebody else's. This is really important to understand, that soul loss begets soul loss. We become the victims of victims. Through contemporary psychology, we know that most abusers were abused themselves. And also soul stealing is a generational wound that people repeat, like a family karma. So when we help a person, or we help ourselves bringing our souls back, it's really important that we educate ourselves or the person that we're working with to understand soul theft and soul loss, so that we can stop this behavior from being passed down to future generations. It's also important to talk about this idea that it takes two to tango, meaning that we are willing victims. And this is really complicated and not easy to talk about, but very often a person's psychic defenses might not be strong enough, and another family member or boss or somebody is basically essentially overpowering us in the battle of the soul, and we give the soul away because we're exhausted, because we don't want to fight anymore, because we don't have what it takes to stand up for ourselves in the moment. For some children, giving a soul part is an attempt to gain love, and this is not something exclusive to children. We do it not only in love relationships, but also in friendships, or even in professional relationships, or even now on kind of social media, right? Like, here's a part of my soul, my essence, take a part of my vitality, my power. Will you love me? Will you validate me? Will you recognize me? So if we're insecure and we don't have a strong sense of self, we don't realize that there's other ways to receive love. We don't have to sell our souls. When we do this, and we do it more, it becomes a negative spiral, in the sense that the more of my soul that I give away, the more insecure and smaller I feel, the less worthy of love I feel. And this is that sort of addictive pattern that comes up as well, of codependency. So really understanding that soul stealing can also be a two-sided coin. Another thing that might happen is that we, with grief and loss, send part of our soul to the person who leaves us, whether the person is still alive or not. We also want to talk about interference of ghosts. There are these kind of entities that I'm going to call soul eaters, who are not able to sustain themselves like humans are, but need somebody else's energy to survive. And we, again, talked more deeply about this in the Chronicles of Darkness, so I'm not going to go in it here. But I do want to talk briefly about the last sort of way that we give a soul away is trading in relationships. And this happens a lot, not only with lovers, but also with parents, and quite often with mothers who find it hard to relate to their child, in the sense that the child is a taker, when it's younger, especially so. But the relationship is a little bit or a lot unbalanced between a mother and a child. The mother is the provider, the sustainer, the giver of life, and the child often does not reciprocate the way the mother wants. So the mother might start punishing the child, forcing the child to comply, needing the child to basically abdicate their own throne in order for the mother to feel good about herself. We can also, like I said, create codependency and forcibly holding on to the soul of a loved one. So they leave us, we send part of our soul with them, or they leave us and we keep part of their soul. So I really want this point to be very clear. I would like you to take a moment to reflect if you have stolen souls without judgment. Without judgment. There's nothing wrong about it in the sense that you didn't know better. Now that you do, let's do better. The last thing I want to say as well is that when we hold on to the soul of a loved one who is passed, or if we send a part of our soul with somebody who's passed, we are going to really, really, really suffer. Just like all the other types of soul loss, it's not going to lead anywhere good unless we retrieve it and return those parts. So again, coming back to this idea that the belief that we can use another person's light, power, energy, or essence for our own good is a misunderstanding. You can reflect somebody's light and power, but you cannot use them as your own source of energy. We have to reach inside of ourselves to find our own power. There are people, entities in our world that very much feed on our souls, that feed on our light, our power, our energy, and our essence. These are not forces for good, period. When we bring our souls back, they come with a lot of gifts and knowledge. And this is part of what our responsibility is as a shaman, to help people recognize the right use of power. Also, the responsibility of a shaman when it comes to working with soul retrieval is huge. And I think the hardest part is really the part about the right use of power, being safe, developing trust, having the integrity and the respect for others. Doing soul retrieval work is incredibly intimate. And it's really important that we create a safe container, because we are going to the hardest places of a person's life story, of their experience. When we understand that, and we understand that we are working with the subliminal, we're working with the imagination, we're working with the intuition, we're working with these tools that require us to be whole in our integrity, then we understand that we have to do this work for ourselves. Even if you want to be a great shaman and you want to help the world, you have to help yourself first, or you will not be a safe person to blow somebody else's soul back into their body. We need to honor the spirits. We need to use the ancient ways in a powerful way. We have to maintain integrity at all times. And I'm really begging you now, please do not dishonor yourself or the people who are important to you or the spirits by trying to do shamanic work without having that sense of the right use of power, of being safe, of having trust with the person you're working with your helping spirits, of being in your integrity and having respect for the work that you're doing. And I want to end with this quote. If you really want to help the world, what you really, really will have to do is to teach how to live in it. Trusting the soul is accomplished by listening to our intuition and examining each of our actions as they apply to our personal path. If we're not happy and honest with ourselves, then we cannot interact in a happy, healthy, and honest way with others. It is so important to understand the work, the work, the work, it's also so important to understand the play and the fun and the laughter and the dancing and the singing. I'll see you in Shamanism 108, where we continue and going deeper into the practice of soul retrieval. Thank you for your time.